And all of that kind of led to, what started out as a lifelong learning exercise, great friendship, and progressed over time. He's been a part of my career from that time forward, and to lose him so young is hard. It's hard, but the times that we had were great, and we did a lot of things. I think that his leadership in the industry will be recognized for many, many, many years to come and generations to come.
Swine.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host for today's Swine podcast. I'm Laura Greiner, and I want to welcome Dr. Steve Moeller to our podcast today. Dr. Steve Moeller is the National Program Leader for Food Animal Production at the USDA. Hi, Steve. How are you today?
Hi, Laura. I'm really good. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and have the opportunity to talk about a great friend of mine.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're certainly happy to have you on, maybe not in the way that we had all hoped, but today is going to be a very special podcast for our listeners. We are going to dedicate this podcast to the life and the accomplishments of Dr. Ken Stalder. For some of you who may not be as familiar with Dr. Ken Stalder, he was very passionate about the swine industry. He was both a national and international leader in swine genetics, and more importantly, was very involved in working with gilt development, structure, and working towards improving sow longevity. For those of us who knew Ken well, there's definitely a hole in our hearts as he left us quite suddenly at the end of October. Not only do we miss his passion for the swine agriculture, as well as just the passion for developing the future leaders through the graduates and undergraduate students, but more importantly, we miss some of his infectious laughs and his jokes and his kind-heartedness that surrounded so many of us. Today, we've asked Steve Moeller to be on today because Steve knew Dr. Stalder quite well. And so again, Steve, we want to thank you for your time today to talk about Ken. And I think maybe we'll just start there is what do you want to share about how you knew Ken, how you got to know him over the years, and then we'll talk a bit about Ken's accomplishments.
Definitely happy to do so, and I echo the words that you just offered. There were so many things that I remember, and was sitting here this morning, in fact, thinking I need some information. I need to call Ken, but Ken's not there, and that's hard. That's hard. But to give you a little background, I met Ken back in the early 1990s as a graduate student at Iowa State. We both worked under Dr. Lauren Christian, who was our mentor, and there was a whole host of us there at Iowa State at that time that had the fortune of working in swine genetics and being actively engaged in a number of projects, including things like the National Bear Show progeny test and completing work on the terminal sire evaluation program and teaching class for undergrads, stepping in anyway and taking over that role. So I really got to know Ken well as we finished our PhDs. And over that time, I remember the times when I was newly married, and within that time frame of finishing, we had our first daughter, and she came into Kildee Hall, and we'd have Ken take over in the morning sometimes while I was in class, or vice versa. And so my daughter Olivia has some experience she probably doesn't obviously remember, but Ken was an integral part, and along with Cheryl and such, as they started their family. So as I think about it, and finished up in 94 there, and went on to work with Ohio State University in a faculty role, Ken was coming out right behind me, and he took a role at University of Tennessee Martin. And we were both at that point in time heavily engaged in extension, and worked hand in hand with our state and, of course, National Pork Producers Council / National Pork Board at that point on various things. We developed curriculum for different production aspects. We worked, of course, with the PQA program, and took that program out to our constituents. And And from the genetics side, we were also very active in the National Swine Improvement Federation. And he and I were a part of the board of directors over the course of years in different roles, and did some work with ultrasound over time, and all of that kind of led to, what started out as a lifelong learning exercise, great friendship, and progressed over time. He's been a part of my career from that time forward, and to lose him so young is hard. It's hard, but the times that we had were great, and we did a lot of things. I think that his leadership in the industry will be recognized for many, many, many years to come and generations to come.
Mm-hmm.
So over the course of our careers, we actually at times competed for the same jobs. When he went to Iowa State University, I also had my name in that hat, and never any concern over who might be the candidate per se, because we continued to work together. It wasn't a competition. It was, how do you help each other? And he's been a tremendous help to me over the years, from his practical knowledge and statistical knowledge, and as I've said to many, he's one of the good guys, and he'll be truly missed by so many.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We're going to talk a little bit about Ken's personality and the personal impact he had on others, but I think first I want to talk a little bit more about some of his accomplishments that we're most familiar with in the swine industry. And you alluded to a little bit there, Steve, of some of the activities you both did together. But as you think about Ken and you think about his career, what are 2 or 3 things that you think that he researched, he created, that you think has left its legacy or its impact on the swine industry today?
Very good question, and one where you could probably go many different directions, but all of them focused, I think, primarily around the sow and the developing and development of that breeding female. When you go back to the work on net present value and the impact of maintaining that female in the herd, and looking at longevity from various angles and aspects and factors that contribute to it, I think he was a leader in that realm. And I think we went through some times in the industry where we knew culling rates, death rates were too high.
Mm-hmm.
And as we think about ways to address that, Ken was a leader in doing the research, and I would also say contributing to the solution through things like the work with National Hog Farmer, where they looked at the different pictures and the poster development that was an outcome. And we of course had many partners over the years in those areas, and Ken took advantage of that. He worked with the industry. He worked with the National Pork Board. He worked with breed organizations to develop those tools that are used around the world. And I made a comment to some people there at his services that, I can still to this day go into barns within the US for certain. And I've been in barns around the world where those posters are on the wall. And they've been there for a long time, and they have the standard fly manure on them and all those things, that we all see, but they're used. And if nothing else, whether it was feet and legs or underlying soundness or some of the defects we find in composition, conformation, I should say, those are things that stay with you. And from the little handbook to the posters, all of those have been actively used by an industry around the world. In addition to that, the areas where he's really had an impact, I think, are the abilities to go out there and be an excellent thinker. One of the things that that you would find in kind of an idiosyncrasy. We'd sit in a meeting, Ken and I'd be usually sitting next to each other, and he'd be writing notes, and he'd pass them over, and we'd do a little check back and forth, because one, he was very congenial and never wanted to interrupt, but two, he's like, what do you think of that? What about this? And we're kind of really like old school passing notes, I guess you'd say. And people would say, he's not paying attention, because sometimes he's doodling, and he really had some pretty cool doodles over the years, I can say that. But if something came up and it piqued his interest, he was right there. And he's asking the question. He asked the tough questions, but he did it in a manner that wasn't offensive. He did it in an inquisitive and how do we learn from this manner, and how do we take this back to the producer and make it have an impact. So I think there was a genuine talent and quality that I truly feel was demonstrated in his research. It was demonstrated in his outreach. And while I didn't get a chance to witness him teaching students at the undergrad level, I can sure see it in the work he's done with his graduate students and out there in the producer audience. Tremendous impact.
Yeah, I would agree. Not that long ago, I was doing some guilt development work, and I too ran across my flip pages of guilt structure and of course the poster. And even the other day, I was doing some discussions around how do we adjust for conception rates in the barn to make targets, and found an Excel sheet that Ken is a part of the creators of, along with a couple of other individuals. And those are older spreadsheets, but they're still extremely useful and very valuable for both, small producers or even for class demonstrations, to get people to think about the total impact. And
yeah.
It wasn't uncommon to sit in those offices with Ken and have those conversations around guilt development, and what should a guilt developer look like, and what are we doing wrong, and what do we need to change, and how do we move forward from here. And so I would agree. I think that was something that was part of Ken. It was just integral. Every time you'd walk next to him, he'd be like, hey, I'm thinking about this, or hey, this is over here and we should really do something about it, or let's go out and get some more data on this. And he was always thinking, always a forward thinker. So.
Absolutely. And you kind of remind me there of some of the the old software programs that were a part of Iowa State's I guess you would say origin, and on floppy disks, in fact. And then on, by golly, we finally moved to modern computers, right? And he kept those up to date, and I suspect they're still around. I suspect that there's application, and I'm hoping, as I think back, that those are things that can be used on the farm. They're inexpensive yet quite valuable, and he had a knack for having the time to dedicate on and focus on those, so that they, what generally through a good graduate student, how do you make this work for the producer? So very good to think about those.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you also talked on one of the other things that I always found interesting when I was visiting with Ken, was really around student development. How do we prepare our next generation of leaders, and what does that look like, and what are the skills they need to know? And Ken was very passionate about communication skills. At least talking to him about his 425, his senior swine class, he spent a large amount of time talking to the students about how do you manage people, how do you work with people, and how do you talk to them in a way that they understand. And, I think that's a piece that, again, many of us are focused on the pig, and rightfully so, but, Ken also saw the other side of that and said, hey, we need to make sure that our students are well aware of how to communicate appropriately. So that was something that always stood out to me as well.
You make a good point there, and from the undergrad and transitioning to the graduate students, I will also say that when you look back on the students that he has influenced directly and indirectly through being on committees and such, they're very well spoken individuals, and that was a kind of a teaching moment for Ken, and he used it that way. I mean, he let them experience things and go to places and engage with individuals that other groups may not have done in their training. And I think that opened them up to really cool opportunities that are, out there today. They're leading a lot of our industry efforts through both academia and industry engagement. So
Mhm.
that's another legacy that I think is critical. If you come out of Ken's program, the other thing I can appreciate is you knew your statistics, and
Yes.
by golly, you were going to be able to explain them. So not every individuals have that talent, but he did to ingrain in the young people the importance of understanding applicability and doing things the right way. I'll use that term, not that we all don't try, but he did a really good job of making sure that his graduate students understood the importance of that in their work.
Mhm, mhm, absolutely. I don't think there was a graduate committee that he didn't serve on where he didn't recommend getting a minor in statistics in whatever program you were studying under, because he felt it was extremely valuable, right?
Absolutely.
To understand,
Absolutely.
for sure. That actually brings me to a point, Steve, that I think is important. Is you mentioned the word a couple of times now, legacy, and I think that's really what we are talking about today is Ken's legacy. And one of the conversations that Ken and I had before his passing was really focused around that next generation of graduate student. What should that look like, and are we missing an opportunity to train them in a new skill set? And his new passion, or his passion more recently, has been around large data and data management and creating individuals that can handle data coming in from different locations and creating sense of it and helping guide production companies or decision makers, and also maybe trying to make efficiency out of the labor needs that we have. And I think that's really important, right? That vision and that insight going forward. And I don't know if you ever had any conversations like that recently about some of his vision, but I think it's important to share with the listeners, where Ken was looking for the industry to go.
You make a good point there, Laura, in that when we've talked about it, it comes down to we're in an information age. We can access things in forms and analyze in platforms that we've really never fully utilized. I'll put it that way. I mean, there are parts of our world that are obviously more advanced, but it is time, as we talked about it, to go to that next level and bioinformatics and apply machine learning, apply artificial intelligence, because some of this data that we have sitting out there served its quote unquote purpose, right, for a manuscript or et cetera. But how do you integrate it? How do you take it to the next level? And I can tell you that in my current role, we have the same discussions within ARS. How do we find individuals trained well enough to understand the biological system, the animal,
Mhm.
and apply the large data to get usable answers? And that's a unique combination. Um, and I'll say it because I think one of Ken's strengths was he grew up on a farm,
Mhm.
and he understood the challenges that come with a day-to-day farm operation, and I'll be honest with you, he overcame them, right? Like many of us, unfortunately, if you lived through the 80s and understood the farm crisis, you understand where some of us get our upbringing and experience that still today leads us down a path that we think is pretty important for our young people to understand. And Ken was one of those. We talked a lot about that over the years. But it is recognition, as I think you say, that we have capabilities that can go further. And I think he had a desire to kind of work on an initiative there at Iowa State. I don't know how far it got personally, but I know we've talked about where he wanted to go. And I think hopefully, there'll be individuals that follow up, hopefully some of his own graduate students and such, as they come into these next roles in their lives, that can take some of that effort forward.
Yeah, very good. One of the other things that, as we sit here and think about Ken and we talk about his successes in life, it brings me back to a question that we always ask our guest speakers on these podcasts: is if you can envision someone in your life who you think is successful, what are some key traits about them that's allowed them to be successful? And I've heard words that describe Ken as approachable and a listener and somebody who cares and somebody who's questioning and curious. And those are all things that have come up in our podcasts from people who define individuals as successful. And I think that says a lot about, as you mentioned early on, it's just who he was. But it's just interesting to me that so many of those traits that we've talked about in the past have come up when we discuss Ken, and that he possessed many of those traits. And here we are today honoring, the impact that he's had on the industry.
Absolutely. And I can echo all of those words that you've used. I think a humble is a word that I would use to describe Ken. And he never looked for the accolades. He kind of sat in the back and let a lot of his value show through his students, show through his colleagues, and I think that was again who he was. And from my personal interaction with him, there were times when he's like, well, you do it for the greater good, and but I'm sure glad he was recognized as a fellow by ASAS and has been recognized by NSIF and various other groups in the time. And I'm sure, I can't project forward, but there's no doubt in my mind that as Ken would have entered the next 5 years or 10 years of his career, that those accomplishments would be recognized further into the future, no doubt about it. Personal and industry impacts, they're already there. I'm just hopeful that someone can carry them on, and we lost a good one. So yeah,
absolutely. You bring up some great points, because you are right. Ken was always the quiet one in the group in some ways, right? Not always in others, but at least as far as receiving his accolades, he was always very quiet and just really wanted to be a part of something to make a difference. Is generally how I viewed Ken, is just somebody who just was willing to do what needed to be done for the great good, as you mentioned.
Yeah, there was a side of Ken that was a bit fiery and but it was passion coming out. It wasn't conflict. It was passion. It's by golly, this is something we need to address, and we're going to take it on and be strong about what we are, our convictions. So absolutely.
The other thing I think you brought up that I think is something that's important for people listening is that thoughtfulness that we communicate about Ken. It's not just being thoughtful about the project at hand or the issue at hand, but in those conversations I've had with him, it's the whole process, right? It's the whole, well, what impact does this have? Not just on the animal, not just on the economics, which Ken was really good at, but also the people, right? And so people for Ken was something that was almost priority number one, at least a lot of times when we talked. And I think that's something that I think is important for people to think about, is every challenge that we have and every decision we make not only matters to the animal and to the business, but it matters to the people. And that was something that Ken really talked a lot about, at least to me.
And I would call Ken and speak, and we, sometimes it'd be frequent, sometimes it'd be less frequent. It all depend on, what came up and what topic we were focused on, whether it was a joint project or just bouncing ideas. He talked always about family first and family last. That was our way. And then in the middle, we talked about, the quote business, and the business was exactly as you say. Yeah, we have an industry that really relies heavily on the personnel investment, and the best laid plans can go awry when you don't have the personnel side, the best pigs, the best facilities, whatever. But you still have to have the people who are dedicated to that industry and need to learn it. So there's a learning curve, and there's a learning experience that we need to make right, so that they're doing the right things on our farm every day. And he recognized that, and it was part of his approach. If you listen to him talk, it wasn't just data, it wasn't just the outcomes, it was how is it going to influence the system. And that system was holistically evaluated and viewed.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think there was a conversation that went by that we didn't talk family first and family last, and everywhere in the middle was the research. But everything on the other side was always the connection with people. And I think that's, again, a part of Ken that made him successful, made him, the person that he was. But also the reason why so many of us feel lost at this moment is because he was that person you could just go to and talk to about research or
really anything. Right? Yeah.
Yep. Well, Steve, as we wrap up our time today, are there any last thoughts or final comments that you would like to make in honor of Ken's memory?
One of the comments that I do want to make is that our major professor, Lauren Christian, we'd have lots of discussions, very similar in some ways to Ken, because we talked pigs all the time. And, at the end of the conversation, the question was, but are the hogs any better? And I remember that many, many, many times. And I've said this at his services as well, that, I can be assured that from Ken's work, the hogs are indeed better. And when I say that, I mean the industry is better, and the people who are in the industry, and the pigs themselves are better. And that was one of his goals, one of his passions. And I miss and think about it every day, what we've done and what he's accomplished. And I'm fortunate, for those who don't know, my daughter was working under Ken on her PhD, and that's another connection that really opened me up to understanding and appreciating Ken, but also just the impact that he's had on young people, including my daughter. So it's going to be it is a big loss, and we'll continue to move forward thinking about his lessons as we go.
Yeah, I think that's a great ending comment. The thought about, are the pigs any better? And using that question to drive forward as we do move forward and we honor Ken and we think about what legacy he brings to the industry and how we choose to remember him in the future by carrying on some of the work that he has started. And so again, I do want to thank you, Steve, for your time today. And obviously we certainly thank Ken for all of the work that he's done over the years, not just in the professional world, but also in our own personal lives. And so
absolutely,
we thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much as well, Laura. I appreciate it. And all your colleagues there at Iowa State. We'll keep moving forward. Ken will want us to.
Yep. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Yeah.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding, by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.